Sorry to interrupt the conversations, but I thought we could get going with this panel. My name is Sanjay Ruparelia. I'm a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel discussion, which is on the global spread of democratic backsliding. I think one way of framing it is that for the last day and a bit, including this morning, of course, we've done a deep dive into the state of democracy in Canada, various challenges and threats that we face at multiple levels, from the municipal to the provincial to the federal. We've looked at different institutions and actors, from the media to the public sphere to post-secondary institutions. And what we wanted to try to do in this panel, following Jagmeet Singh, what he said last night at the Walrus debate, was to think about the wider environment in which these developments in Canada are taking place. And that wider environment is literally the international. So it's a comparative global perspective we want to try to bring. That's the whole world, so we're only going to give some highlights on that. But that's the purpose of this panel. We have two great panelists with us. Annika Silva-Leander, who is the head of the North America Division of International IDEA, one of the major civic organizations working on democracy in the world. Her areas of specialization are civic engagement, social policy, and sustainable development. And we have David Salvo, who's Managing Director of Transatlantic Policy and Programming at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in Washington, D.C., and a number of other offices as well. His expertise is in Russia, U.S.-Russia relations, and foreign interference. My own work for a very long time has been on India, and then more recently China, South Africa, and Brazil. So that gives you a sense of where we normally come from in terms of our perspectives. And I thought we'd set it up by sort of saying we're going to try to do three things. One is to give a snapshot. What's happening in Canada vis-a-vis other parts of the world? You know, what's the state of our democracy here? The second, what do we mean by backsliding? Because there's a lot of debate around that term. We've been using it a lot. Why and how does it happen in different contexts? What are the drivers? What are the conditions? What are the processes by which this takes place? And then third, really importantly, where have we seen pushback? Which democracies have been more resilient, and why? Is it because there are certain counter movements that have developed? Are there certain reforms that have taken place? Are there certain innovations that we should be considering and embracing to revitalize our democratic systems? So the first thing I wanted to do, it's already up, is the first question. We want to kind of take a temperature in the room, see what people are thinking. And the first question is simply, is democracy in Canada backsliding more than other countries that are comparable, as much as, or less than? And so I know people are still trickling in. We've only got 38 responses so far. But that in itself is interesting. That so far, at least, it seems like most people here think that as much, it's a condition that affects us as much as many others, but there's quite a large proportion who think that it's less. And very few in the room think that things are worse here than they are in many other countries. So we've only got 45 of these responses. Maybe we'll throw them up again as people come in. There's a second question we want to ask you. So if we could move to that one. And this is to kind of get at the issue of what's driving backsliding in different countries. So are the challenges facing democracy in Canada primarily homegrown? And we've just heard a panel about the long histories of colonization in this country and how that affects both Indigenous peoples and their communities, as well as democratic governance in Canada. Or are they transnational? You know, what were the primary threats that we face? So these are two questions I guess we'll toggle back and forth as people are coming back into the conversation. But with that, I want to turn it over to Annika, who's going to give us a brief overview of where Canada fits in the global landscape in terms of the work that International IDEA is doing.
Thanks so much, Sanjay. Thanks for having me here, part of this really interesting conversation. Bonjour à tous. Je ne vais pas parler en français, mais je voulais dire quelques mots dans la tradition bilingue canadienne. I'll continue in English. So Sanjay introduced International IDEA. We are an intergovernmental international organization with a mandate to strengthen democracy around the world. We have been around for 30 years. We have 35 member states from all over the world. Canada is a member state of International IDEA. We do policy research on democratic strengthening and democracy protection across a number of different thematic areas, including electoral processes, but also inclusive participation, representation, deliberative democracy mechanisms, the impact of technology on democracy, climate change and democracy, and other issue areas. And then we provide technical assistance and capacity building to democratic reformers and institutions around the world, mainly in newer democracies, but increasingly also in established democracies. And then we also conduct advocacy in multilateral fora and spaces to put democracy on the agenda of those organizations, the UN, but also regional organizations like the EU and the African Union. Our flagship report is the Global State of Democracy report. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. It comes out every year in time for International Democracy Day, and we look at global democratic trends in the report. And the report relies on a quantitative data set of democratic quality that covers 173 countries in the world from 1975 until today. And we measure 30 indicators of democratic quality. So some of the data points that I'll refer to today and the analysis comes from that report. I wanted to start off by saying how interesting it has been for me to attend the Canadian Vote Summit. This is the second year, first time was last year. And it's been really an eye-opening event for me because you have been so candid this year and last year about the challenges that Canadian democracy is facing. And that's been really impressive to me because when we look at Canada in our data set, in our comparative analysis, Canada comes up at the top among the highest performing democracies in the world. And if we go to the next slide, just wanted to briefly mention how we measure democracy because that will explain some of the data points that I'll refer to. We think that democracy relies on 4 core pillars. So representation, of course, elections, free political parties, effective parliaments. The second pillar is rights, and there our definition is much broader than most traditional definitions of democracy because we include political and civil rights, but also social and economic rights. Then rule of law and citizen participation, both through civil society organizations and also through elections at subnational and national level. So if we use that framework and we go to the next slide, we can see that Canadian democracy, if we measure those 4 key pillars on a scale from 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest score, we see that Canada scores in the high range, so above 0.7 on the 4 pillars. And we also see that Canada ranks very high in comparison to other countries among the 31 highest performing countries in the world. Actually, Canada is one of only 20 countries in the world that perform high across the 4 pillars. So that's really impressive if we look at the aggregate level. But if we dig down a little bit deeper and we go to the next slide, we disaggregate into sub-indicators. Under those pillars, we see that there's some areas where Canada performs less well. So even though Canada performs high on most of its indicators, there are 6 indicators where we see more of a mixed picture, where Canada performs either low or mid-range. So direct democracy, you can see here, very low score, well below the OECD average. It's interesting to me because of the conversations you've been having today and yesterday about the referendum, forthcoming one here in Alberta. It's a direct democracy mechanism. And I've been hearing how they are employed, not just referenda, but also citizens' assemblies and other of those kinds of mechanisms at the provincial level. Maybe the score is low because we're measuring the federal level. If we look at the other indicators where we see a mid-range performance, economic equality, which is one of the socioeconomic indicators that we measure under the rights dimension, is mid-range. And you can see here it's well below the OECD average. That's the case for the rest of the indicators that are mid-range as well. Electoral participation, That was actually quite surprising to me when I saw that. Civil society, effective parliament, and predictable enforcement of laws. If we go to the next slide, we can also see how Canadian democracy has performed over the last decade. This measures declines, areas that have declined over the last decade. So I can say in response to the Mentimeter question, Canada is not backsliding democratically to the same extent as other countries are, where we see a deeper and more severe decline. But we see decline on 5 key dimensions in the past 10 years. And those are important to pay attention to. If you were to ask me about one pressure point, in particular, I would point out economic equality. That's the score that scores mid-range now, and we've seen a decline from a high score to a mid-range score on that. And it's an important pressure point because it is one of the drivers of democratic backsliding. So I would pay particular attention to that. I think freedom of religion was a decline that surprised me. Canada actually scored perfectly, very rare, 10 years ago, and that score still remains high, but it's declined significantly in the past 10 years. And then other indicators that have declined are predictable enforcement, rule of law, and freedom of expression. If we go to the next one. Oh, Canada versus the United States. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. I'll stop here and over to you, Sanjay.
Well, thanks so much for that, and particularly disaggregating a lot of the measures. I just want to clarify, in your report, whether it's like other reports, are these expert surveys it's expert assessments of the state of democracy along all these measures in the country that compiles the index?
So we use a combination of different data sources. Expert data is one of the sources. We also use observational data. What we don't include is public opinion data. Okay.
So I just want to turn it to David. How do you, when you look at that from the vantage of the United States, but of course you also, your organization is doing work, you're saying about the open office in Ottawa, in Canada, how do you sort of see this portrait of Canada in a kind of more comparative perspective?
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. It's always great to be at the Canadian Vote Summit. You know, my reaction to this data is you see a lot of the indicators of what precipitates democratic backsliding, but it's not a given that Canada is necessarily going to end up in a position like the United States or Hungary of the last 15 years. And I think we have a tendency to otherize or demonize people and citizens who find themselves, you know, on the wrong end of some of these statistics, like economic equality, and they're frustrated with the democratic establishment. They are inclined to seek answers in populism or in separatism, or you pick your movement. But we have to remember that they don't see themselves necessarily as anti-democratic. In fact, that's where I think we tend to get into a lot of trouble, because it takes time to end up where the United States is right now. It took time for Hungary to end up where it was. Viktor Orban wasn't an autocrat overnight. And I think we have to remember that the Alberta separatists don't see themselves as authoritarians. Many of the MAGA coalition supporters don't see themselves as autocrats or supporting autocracy. In fact, they see themselves as challenging authoritarian overreach by the people whom we would all agree are Democrats. So lowercase d Democrats. So I think what's important about seeing data like this is we understand where the trend lines are going. But if you're going to build a big tent coalition to arrest some of the worst manifestations of where this data could, lead a country, you can't just be pushing people away by breaking them into, Democrats and autocrats. I think we've run into that problem in the United States. I think other countries have run into that problem too. I saw it firsthand living in Bosnia. I lived in the Bosnian Serb entity where, now it's essentially captured by Russia and the leader is a tried and true authoritarian, but he didn't start there. And it takes a while for institutions to be captured. It takes a while for some of the things I think we're going to talk about in this panel to unfold. So, it's more a plea to use this data to actually try to broaden the coalition and not try to demonize or otherize those who, may not be exactly where we are on various issues. And I think that's particularly relevant here right now.
I mean, that's really important. And of course, a major theme of this entire summit is the importance of dialogue and to see things from a different perspective. The fact that, this year is in Calgary to try to have a different vantage, even within this country. One thing I wanted to just pick up before we turn into questions of how backsliding occurs. One way of thinking about it is, it's a bit of a wonkish debate, but it's an important one amongst political scientists. I think for a long time over the last decade, there was a sense that backsliding is occurring in virtually every region of the world, and we can see instances of that everywhere. And typically we think of it as an erosion or deterioration in norms, institutions, practices we associate with good democratic governance. That's a sort of standard definition. It takes various manifestations like executive overreach, the rise of kind of ethno-nationalism in many cases that are excluding minorities in particular, of suppression on civil liberties, political rights. But one thing I just wanted to pick up on before we move to the transnational aspect is what your organization does, and it's really important because a lot of traditional indices of democracy and even our theories don't really focus on the socioeconomic foundations of modern democracies. We tend to focus on civil liberties and political rights. And I want to see if you could speak a little bit more about this question of the economic inequality, which of course when you read the papers and turn on the news, that's what we've been talking about in the neoliberal era. But somehow, when we study democratic backsliding, it gets less attention than I think amongst academics even, than it does in the popular press in terms of common perceptions. Can you say a little bit more about why you think that's important? And it seems quite troubling in the case of Canada, even though relatively it's doing well, that one of the areas in which there has been regression is on questions of economic equality.
Yeah, the way we define democracy, economic equality is a dimension of democratic quality. Most other measures, or many other measures, have more minimalist definitions of democracy, so they focus on the electoral pillar and some a little bit broader rule of law and rights, but not necessarily economic rights. But we think that it's important to look at economic rights as well, and we've actually we didn't have an indicator of economic equality at the very beginning when we launched our framework back in 2017, and we've added it since 2 years ago actually, because we think it's important to measure it. I think what the research and the scholarly research has focused more on is, because there are scholarly debates, as you well know, about the advantage and disadvantage of having a more narrow versus a broader definition of democracy, and some of the critiques against the work that we do and VDM and Freedom House is the conceptual inflation that happens when you broaden the definition, because then you can see more declines. But what scholars have focused on a lot, though, is economic inequality as a driver of democratic backsliding. And I think that that's really interesting. Susan Stokes and a researcher at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, they came out with a study recently where they had done a statistical analysis of the different drivers of democratic backsliding, and they found that controlling for other factors, rising economic inequality was one of the key drivers. It's a predictor, right? So not necessarily all countries that have high or rising inequalities backslide, but it is definitely an important predictor. And so I think it's something that is worth paying attention to. It was interesting when I looked at the data on Canada and the US, the level of economic inequality is actually the same for both countries. That's something that surprised me. I thought it was much higher in the US, given also the more extended welfare system that Canada has and so on. And I think in the US, it has to be factored into the backsliding that we are seeing, because generally what we're seeing is that the backsliding occurs in countries where portions of the population feel grievances of different kinds. And economic inequality as a lived reality or as a perception is one of those key grievances that drive voters towards political parties and leaders that offer simple solutions to those grievances. So yeah, that would be my take on that dimension.
And that makes sense, because I was just thinking yesterday, we spoke so much about questions of health and education, cost of living, affordability crises. David, do you have any just brief reactions to that before we turn to the more international, transnational dimensions?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe, I agree with Annika. I think populism is often born out of that specific grievance towards economic equality. It certainly was the seed of the MAGA coalition in the United States, which, you know, is not just a bunch of racists. It's also two-time Obama voters from the Rust Belt who, you know, didn't have jobs to return to and were frustrated, and they were offered a simple solution to a complex problem, as Annika said. And now you have, you know, a Big Tent political coalition that's populist in nature, that's transpartisan in its core, believe it or not, and, you know, is manipulated ultimately by a demagogue who does have more autocratic tendencies. And that's not unique to the United States. We've seen this in Central and Eastern Europe too, where, you know, people who are frustrated by cost of living going up or their inability to get ahead are more inclined to challenge the establishment and get behind an anti-establishmentarian candidate. So I think, like, that is a cautionary tale for Canada, especially seeing this data about economic inequality. And that's not to say, I know, look, as an American who spends a lot of time in Canada, I know enough to say Canada and the United States are I know, I'm not trying to say that Canada's going to end up where the US is, but these are red flags to pay attention to. And I'm sure that, you know, the political parties here are attuned to data like that, and are trying to capitalize on it for their own political gain, which is what politicians do. But as citizens and as representatives of civil society, like, this should really be an alarm bell and like a call to action to ensure that Canada doesn't end up where, you know, a Poland ended up, or a Hungary ended up, or a United States ended up.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all of our democracies, they have a test of performance legitimacy, and that's an aspect of that. If we can turn now to the question, which is, I wanted to do this first before we sort of set up the main theme of this panel, which is thinking about how do foreign developments, how do foreign actors, how do foreign processes affect what's happening within a country, so in our case, Canada. And I could think initially of sort of just abstractly 3 ways you could think about this. You know, one is a model of emulation. So you see a democratically elected leader who becomes autocratic, concentrates executive power, suppresses civil liberties, manipulates elections, and so on and so forth. So emulation would be one mechanism or process where you might see this happening. So for a long time, people said Viktor Orban was developing a toolkit, and other would-be autocrats were copying that, but from afar. There was no conscious or work going on between these two parties. The second would be coordination, where there's actually a sharing of knowledge, practices, and so on between leaders who have a sympathy for each other. And the third, of course, which you've worked on, it's been a big issue in Canada, of course, is the question of foreign interference, interventions by external actors, sometimes with complicity of domestic actors, sometimes not. If you could speak about, I mean, those are just 3 ways I think about it. How do you think about the transnational mechanisms of democratic backsliding? Annika.
Yeah, maybe just before I answer that, I do think that it's important to qualify when we're talking about backsliding. I said it a little bit at the beginning, but just to give you a data point, there have been declines in Canada they're not comparable to the declines that we've seen in the US. And so just to put it in a global perspective, if you look at the declines that Canada has seen, it's sort of mid-range among the countries that have seen declines. The US situates itself, we're looking at the last 5 years. The US is among the 13 countries in the world with the most severe declines in the last 5 years. And the other countries are countries that have experienced military coups. So Canada is doing okay. It's not comparable, but as you said, David, some of the red flags that we're seeing in our data, they're worth paying attention to, and that's why this summit is so important, because you're talking about these issues, and that's so important in an established democracy like Canada. Even in such democracies, we know now that democracy should not be taken for granted. So it's very important that you're having these discussions. On the question you asked about, how backsliding travels internationally, there are a number of pathways through which, backsliding can travel. Let's remember that it traveled in a positive direction in the 90s, and there was a lot of optimism. There was the peak of the third wave of democratization, where countries were moving towards democracy, transitioning to democracy for the first time, and that was a positive diffusion. Now it's a negative diffusion. One is the demonstration effect, so large, geopolitically powerful countries and leaders that undermine democratic norms in different ways, that behavior becoming normalized and more accepted, and countries around the world see that behavior can be modeled without major consequences, either domestically, even rewards, or internationally. So that's one pathway, the demonstration effect. I think the other is, and I'm sure you'll talk more about that, David, as well, is the transnational networks. I mean, autocrats, autocratic leaders, parties, funders, they are organized transnationally. They have networks where they share tactics, they fund each other, and they support each other. And so if we're talking about the tactics to counter that, important also to create similar networks on the democratic side, small d side. Those transnational networks, they also share and they diffuse narratives. And the couple of narratives that have gained ground in the last few years, one is the narrative that authoritarian governance is more effective than democratic governance. China's economic model has provided, the proof for many that authoritarian governance works better than democratic governance. What we do at International IDEA is help to debunk that myth through our data, because what we see is that China is really the exception rather than the rule. Generally, democracies perform much better economically and in terms of shared prosperity than authoritarian regimes. China is the outlier there. Another narrative that was quite common during the pandemic is that authoritarian governments managed the pandemic much more effectively, and we know now in hindsight that wasn't the case. And let's also remember that authoritarian governance often manipulate economic statistics and health statistics. So that's another narrative. Now also the narrative on electoral fraud. I think that started in the US. Disinformation and lies about electoral fraud occurring when it hasn't, and there hasn't been any proof. That narrative, you've seen attempts at it in other countries, but it's been debunked much more quickly and effectively than in the US, where it still remains, accepted in parts of the electorate. But those are some of the pathways. Maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, David?
Yeah, there's one element I would add, and that is there are structural, legislative, and policy vulnerabilities in every country that facilitate this type of transnational anti-democratic ecosystem. So, for example, in Canada, your information system is not sovereign. No one's information system is sovereign today, but you share an enormous information space with your southern neighbor, right, my country, and because of that, there's a real intertwining of these networks that fuel some of the maybe less savory tendencies here, right? That is a structural vulnerability that facilitates a lot of this, these lessons learned and the info sharing and even funding. And it's the same in Europe, for example. So that's not unique to Canada, of course. But there are also domestic policy and legislative choices that countries make that invite unwittingly foreign actors who have a vested interest in wanting to upend sort of the democratic order. And Canada is not immune to that. Yesterday I was fascinated by the opening panel talking about, the cross-border exchanges about, the separatism referendum. Well, who's to say that there can't be a massive influx of money from the United States or Russia, or pick your foreign state actors, to essentially promote separatist content here in Alberta? That, I was reading the Elections Canada guidelines about what's regulated and unregulated according to Canada's election laws. It was unclear to me, and there's someone from Elections Canada in here, please correct the record if I'm wrong, but it was unclear to me that just supporting content that was pro-separatist would be regulated, even if that money was coming from a foreign country, right? So there are these political policy and legislative vulnerabilities that permit this type of, transnational or international ecosystem. And some of it's democratic and some of it is not. And in the 90s, we had, by and large, official and civil society exchanges that were largely based on democracy promotion. Well, that's changed. That has changed. And it's clearly, we might characterize it as anti-democratic. Those people might not. Those people see it as, establishing just an alternative vision for what is, actually democracy. But, we should see it for what it is.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So before we open up to Q&A, and I want to leave enough time for that, I want to end on a more positive note, and also we've seen it's been very instructive in the last couple of years as well, where countries have pushed back against active efforts to erode democratic institutions or norms or practices. Some countries, of course, jump out. We can talk about the recent elections in Poland and Hungary, and it seems to be a mixed outcome so far, but those would be two cases you could think about. You could think about South Korea, where there was an attempt to implement martial law, and that president has been impeached. You can think of Brazil, where the Supreme Court did something the U.S. court didn't do. And in a replay of January 6th, in this case January 8th in 2023 in Brazil, an attempted coup was forestalled and pushed back, and the Supreme Court actually has jailed former President Bolsonaro. There's still outstanding cases in the courts, but these are just some instances where we've seen other democracies in Eastern Europe, in East Asia, and Latin America, push back. And so when you look at countries around the world, where do you see, what lessons can we learn for countries that have been either actively pushing back against attempts to undermine democratic institutions' practices, or which ones have proven more resilient? I mean, those are two different questions, but if you could speak briefly to that, then we'll open it up.
Yeah, now you mentioned some of the cases where we've seen democratic backsliding being reversed or being in the process of being reversed. I think, in all those cases, you mentioned Brazil, you mentioned Hungary and Poland, elections mattered, and elections enabled political change in those countries. I think as long the lesson there is even in contexts such as the Hungarian, for example, where the constitution and the electoral system had been gerrymandered to favor the Fidesz party, making it not undermining the fairness and the competition for other political parties. There were still elections, and they were maybe not as fair as one would have wanted, but there were still elections. Political opposition parties were not banned. And I think when that space still exists, if the electoral chooses to vote in a certain way, you can still produce political change. So I think that that's important. Now, so elections matter. Now, in the case of both Poland and Hungary, what was needed, given especially in Hungary, the gerrymandered political system that favored the governing party was a broad coalition, broad societal coalition and political coalition of parties from different parts of the political spectrum that came together to counter the governing party. I think that was essential in what we saw happening in Hungary. And in all those cases also, popular dissatisfaction with the performance of the governments that were in power. I think the other lesson learned is civil society participation, mobilization. Civil society maybe cannot on their own produce political change, but they play a key role in mobilizing protests, in mobilizing voters, in checking government excesses, documenting government abuse. So that's also key. I think in the case of Brazil, independent institutions, which in the case of Poland and Hungary had been captured by the governing parties. In Brazil, you still had independent institutions, both an independent electoral tribunal and Supreme Court that were able to, penalize the behavior of Jair Bolsonaro. And then ultimately also in the case of Brazil, where this attempt at spreading the disinformation about election fraud, that didn't gain ground because the political establishment, including the party of Bolsonaro, stopped that in its course. And that is, a consensual agreement among the political parties about support and respect for basic democratic norms, which is respect for electoral results and peaceful transfers of power. And in this day and age, that is not a given. But I think that played a key role in countering the developments that we saw in those countries. Ultimately, also, just finally, civilian control of the military, the fact that there was still civilian control of the military in all those places, as opposed to, for example, Venezuela, as also a key, an aspect that we don't often talk about. But David.
So mobilizing a broad coalition and fighting elections as still that key mechanism to push back. What else would you add, David?
I don't think I could add anything to that list. That is literally exactly what I was going to highlight. You have some room for civil society still to operate. You have a mobilized political opposition that increasingly involves like a broader tent coalition because people are frustrated by authoritarian overreach. And elections, even though there's pressure and they're gerrymandered in a way to favor the ruling regime, they're still free-ish and fair-ish enough to allow for a credible result in favor of the opposition. So, yeah.
Great. If we can turn open to questions, I think we have about 5 minutes, unless, what I wanted to try to do is maybe take 3 questions at a time, just so that we make sure that there's enough. So I know there's 2 hands over there on the far left. Is anyone on this side? So I think there's 2 hands on this side of the room. So we can take these 2 questions together and then have a chance for the panelists to respond.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about the literature on the link between economic inequality and democratic backsliding. You mentioned that economic inequality is a predictor for democratic backsliding, controlling for other factors, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what those control variables are.
Thank you. And there's a second question.
Thank you. Hello there. So my question is, how do you reach out to voters such as, the pro-separatists here in this province, or the MAGA voters in the 10 swing states in the 2024 U.S. presidential election in a comprehensive and, most importantly, in an empathetic, like showing empathy to their plight and to their issues, and why ultimately they are either supporting these movements or voting for like a populist candidate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Annika, do you want to take the first question and David the second?
Yeah, no, the data that I cited on economic equality being a key driver of democratic backsliding is not our research. It's a research by Suzanne Stoke and another collaborator. I mean, the control variables, I'm not going to list all of them, and I'm not familiar with all the control variables, but I imagine that some of the indicators that they controlled for was, you know, age of democracy, level of democratic development, strength of political institutions and democratic institutions, maybe also economic levels of economic development. Yeah, that would be.
I would say a focus on corruption is usually a good tactic to take to peel off people who are supportive of an authoritarian regime. I'll leave the separatists out of it because I don't want to call them corrupt. I don't know enough about them to say whether they're corrupt or not. But if you look at Hungary, for example, the man who defeated Orban was a former Orban supporter himself. He wasn't demonizing everyone who supported Orban as, you know, I don't know, racist or what, pick your term, right? There's an empathy there already. Like, I understand your grievances. Look at how corrupt this government has been. Even someone like Alexander Navalny in Russia, major, you know, now deceased opposition figure, he gained a lot of his support by not just opposing all of Vladimir Putin's, you know, policies de facto, but by focusing on corruption, right? He was a nationalist. He was potentially even a nativist, but he focused on corruption and garnered, you know, a whole, you know, groundswell of support, and that's why he was so dangerous to the Kremlin, right? So I think, you know, in the States too, this is how we're going to need a messenger who speaks to those former Obama voters who are disaffected, you know, former Democrats who now have no political home and saw the MAGA coalition as a home for, you know, their economic grievances. It's the same way. So there's a real, you have to be able to speak in their language without demonizing them or branding them as, you know, authoritarians or racist or whatever, you know. I think that's the, and focus on the corruption. Like that's the tactic.
I think I'm looking at our mom, we're out of time. Yes. So we've scratched the surface on many different parts of the world, but I want to thank you both for your insights and observations. And I think it's really important to put Canada in global perspective, because sometimes you just want to see, you know, how are things faring here. And clearly from your report, and there are other reports, but from this one, we're doing much better than many other democracies in the world, but there are warning signs, as you say, and we shouldn't be complacent. And clearly all the discussion over the last day here, there's a very little sign of complacency, and there's a lot of concern. So I think this was really helpful to put this into perspective. Thank you.